Hey everyone, it's Selwen here, bringing you the complete look or overview on the Frost decays. Now, just like Unholy, we have looked at Frost briefly in the past, but like most specs right now, we have the full scope of what new toys Frost is getting for Shadowlands. So let's talk about them all. Do remember and keep in mind that tuning is not done up until release, so there's a few things that may still change, and if you tried out Frost in the pre-patch or in the PTR, do take in mind as well that there are still a lot of things missing that are only accessible in Shadowlands levels. So again, do take that in mind. As for the overall feel of the spec, it's much in the same as BFA, just like it was in Unholy, okay? The core ideas are the same. We still have some GCD issues in our CDs, and especially in our openers, that hopefully get ironed out, and we still have that weird thing where if you want to do any sort of sustainable AoE, you still have to rely, for the most part, on our talents. But general gameplay-wise is what you have come to expect from Frost. So without any further ado, let's take a quick look at our ability changes, what has been unpruned and what has changed overall. Do feel free to skip to the more Shadowlands specific powers and additions. So unpruned abilities, much like Unholy, we have some thematic abilities back, like anti-magic zone for extra and a unique type of utility, Lichborn and sacrificial ghoul with our temporary ghoul summon, which is pretty cool for a self-heal and some extra AoE damage. We also get a death coil and a death and decay for Frost. Death coil damage is pretty minor outside of giving you a ranged ability that you can use, but you can also take advantage of the cool mechanic with Lichborn to self-heal if need. As for Death and Decay, you only get any real benefit if you go for Death's Due Covenant ability that will replace D&D, that we'll talk about later on. That said, it would be interesting to see Death and Decay allowing our Obliterate or even Frost Strike to cleave just like Blood or Unholy can, giving Frost a cool multi-target ability without relying on talents. But hey, I guess there's still time. We also get the beloved two-handed Frost back with a new/old passive Might of the Frozen Wastes in effort to balance out dual wielding versus two-handed, by giving dual wielders extra damage from your core abilities from your offhand as you are accustomed to, and giving you the benefit of having two rune forges, of which we have a couple of new ones, including the most interesting one for Frost, Rune of Hysteria, increasing runic power by 20 and runic power generation by 20% on a proc, which is really good for the breath build. As for two-handers, if you're using that, you get 25% extra damage on obliterates and increases your chances at killing machines, potentially interesting for obliteration build, and some other things that we're gonna talk about. Is it perfectly balanced weapons-wise? Not really, due to large part again on rune forges, but hopefully it will be properly balanced at release. One can hope, right? We also get the amazing thematic Frostworm Fury baseline, our big old dragon for some big burst damage in any situation, and we also have some cool synergies with Legendaries that improves it, that we'll talk about. And last but not least, our Killing Machine proc now also deals frost damage with our obliterates, fixing some of the potential scaling issues with the spec. As for our current abilities, like our base core abilities, we just get new ranks for flat damage increases, like 20% more damage on Frost Strikes, for an example, as you level through Shadowlands. When it comes to talents, not many changes, but some might still be switching places as we go through tuning. We got a slight buff to runic attenuation from 3 to 5 runic power with an increase to its proc chance per minute. We have the dreaded AoE cap on our Frost Scythe that now only hits 5 targets, which to me honestly feels so goddamn bad. Frost Scythe is such a cool ability, and having a group of mobs and only hitting 5 of them feels very off for such a sweeping type of spell. We do get a new talent in place of our dragon, which is Hypothermic Presence, a new buff type of ability that is off the GCD, which is great, reducing runic power costing abilities by 35% for 8 seconds. Great overall, but creating a special great synergy with the breath build. As for the last tier, we also get a small buff to ice cap from 3 to 4 seconds, and our breath talent is still very much alive, as you probably can tell, and more on that later. Let's talk then about Legendaries. Yes, one of the very cool power-based features of Shadowlands. Now, there is quite a lot of Legendaries coming to basically every class and spec, some of which are completely class-wide. Every class can get them, which I'll not mention them as they are quite specific to certain types of content. We also have some which are spec-wide for all DK specs. They are pretty cool in their own right, such as Super Strain, applying all of the DK's 3 dots. Very cool for Unholy, a great potential for AoE situations, and it's pretty decent for Frost as well. We also have some utility-based or survivability ones which are awesome in their own right as well, depending on what you're facing, but I'll focus more on the Frost specific Legos as those actually influence gameplay in some meaningful ways. So we have my favorite, which is Rage of the Frozen Champion, giving an increased chance on your rhyme procs by 15% and making our rhymes Howling Blasts still grant runic power. This was an amazing set bonus of Nighthold tier set in Legion that gave all of us great memories with the breath build. I loved Nighthold Frost Decay, and this does offer that sort of playstyle. This in combination with our changes, our new rune, Hypothermic Presence, and some Conduits and Covenant ability synergies, and we can have some really powerful and long breaths windows. Abilities will be tuned, but there's some great potential still, if breath is your thing. Frostworm Fury, another Legion-based ability, or rather legendary, is also back, giving our Obliterates 10% increased damage and 15% chance to refund the 2 runes. Seems to create a nice synergy if you're going for the 2-handed for big Obliterates and the Obliteration build. But a good, solid choice throughout, seemingly so. We also get Biting Cold, which is the more AoE-oriented legendary, increasing the damage of Remorseless Winter by 15%, and the first time it hits 3 enemies it procs Rhyme. So our Azurite trait, essentially, great synergy with Gathering Storm talent and the Conduit power that we can talk about, but in general seems like your go-to for AoE situations. And lastly, there's Absolute Zero, similar to Biting Cold, focusing around AoE, but this time on our Frostworm Fury, to reduce its cooldown by 50% down to 1.5 minutes, which is really low for such a powerful ability, and freezing every enemy hit for 3 seconds. Pretty OP for big pools in Mythic Plus and dungeons in general. So with that, let's move on to talk about Covenant abilities and then Soulbinds. So let's then mention the biggest one at the moment. Again, Covenant abilities are in the process of being tuned. This is just for you to get an idea of what you're getting. So, Death's Due, the Night Fake Covenant ability. It's replacing your Death and Decay, making it far more useful for Frost, dealing higher damage, but also providing a strength / damage reduction buff as it takes on enemies, to a max of 15% of strength, which creates an amazing synergy with all of our cooldowns, and working virtually in every situation thrown at you, for a flat damage increase to all of our damage, unless the tank pulls mobs away from it. Yeah, that happens. Then we get the Shackled Unworthy, the Kyrian Covenant ability. This one is a simple dot ability that you can use every 1 minute. But as you spend runes inside of that window, it reduces its cooldown by 4 seconds per rune. So say inside a breath window, you're gonna reduce it by quite a lot as you're gonna spend a lot of runes, and will scale rather well with gear to effectively have it always up on, say, a boss. Also granting a 5% damage reduction on top of that. Works pretty well, although subjectively very boring to press, very underwhelming to press, and only benefiting you in single target situations. You do get a Conduit to improve it, where it gives a very small chance to spread it to a nearby target on its fix, which helps, but the chance is pretty goddamn low. As for the Necrolord's Covenant ability, is very cool, awesome even, thematic-wise for decays, but sadly the ability is lagging behind in comparison. Abomination Limb is a new shadow-based AoE ability that slaps enemies, which again, super cool, and also gripping a random enemy every few seconds. Overall, outside of it being super fun to press, because it just looks so goddamn cool, doesn't really offer anything special to Frost. Its main appeal of gripping is way too lackluster to target enemies with. You do get a Conduit to improve its damage by 50% on the targets pulled, effectively improving its single target damage, but it still won't work on bosses or enemies that are immune to grips, reducing a lot of its worth, which is pretty sad. And lastly, there's the Venthyr Covenant ability, Swarming Mists. Like Death's do, it's pretty interesting. Another shadow-based AoE ability, damaging all targets and giving you some increased dodge chance. And as it ticks, it gives you 3 runic power, up to 15 runic power per tick, giving you a shitload of runic power for your breath. Outside of breath though, getting a lot of runic power is not that useful for you in, say, an AoE situation, since you don't have an easy dump like an Holy Epidemic, and these are the situations where you want to use Swarming Mists to get a lot of runic power. And you also have random procs and Conduit procs that we're gonna talk about that often forces you to use rune-based abilities, like killing machines, potentially making you overcap runic power with this ability, since you don't really have an ability to dump runic power with outside of Frost Strike, feeling a little bit counterintuitive overall, outside of the breath. So all in all, Covenant abilities still need some work. However, like I said in Unholy, we also get signature Covenant abilities that every class gets, and both the Venthyr and the Night Fae offer powerful mobility abilities, which for a class like the Decays, we're gonna benefit by quite a lot, like Soul Shape, potentially even increasing our damage from being able to get to enemies and dealing with mechanics quicker and easier. Now, I know this is a lot, but there's one last thing to talk about, and that is Conduits and Soulbinds. Now, Soulbinds on themselves are like the signature abilities. It's the same for every class. So the tiers is the same for every class. So I'm not going to touch a lot on those as it would get super repetitive. There's some pretty powerful proc things to increase your stats, be mastery or haste and so on, but most can be either flavorful or utility based, so on to Conduits. We have 3 types out of our new library that you're going to grind out in Shadowlands. We have Potency, Finesse, and Endurance based Conduits, DPS, Utility, and Survivability, respectively. So on Potency Conduits, of which we can apply 3 Conduits in all of the Soulbind trees, we have another Biting Cold power, further increasing Remorseless Winter damage by 2%, stacking up to 10 times per target hit. That 2% may increase depending on your Conduit item level, providing great synergy with Legendary of the same name and Gathering Storm, which is pretty cool. Unleashed Frenzy is providing a buff that comes from Frost Strike's 1% strength for 6 seconds, stacking up to 5 times, much like Icy Talents, and much like that ability, I would love to see this effect be based on runic power spending abilities, so you could use it and synergize it with Breath. We have Eradicated Blow. Your obliterates increases the damage of your next Frost Strike by 10%, stacking up to 2 times. Just good overall, but especially interesting for that obliteration style of play. And lastly, Accelerated Cold, improving our empowered rune weapon to recharge 5% faster and provide a 10% haste buff that may increase again in numbers with item level. Overall good, but especially good with the breath style of play. If you're wondering about finesse and endurance, conduits look like, well, it's the same for every DK spec, so the same as Unholy. Buffs to many of your defensive or utility-like abilities, such as reduction on CDs like Aspound, Fortitude, or slightly more powerful like 5% damage reduction when you use Lichborn, or more interestingly, a runic power on your interrupts, which is actually pretty cool. But due to the nature of Soulbind trees, if you want to have 3 potency conduits, so the DPS conduits, you're not going to be able to use many endurance or finesse conduits at the same time. That's where your other Soulbinds would come in to form loadouts, essentially. So all in all, it seems the goal with Frost and Shadowlands is to offer 2 main styles of play, breath and obliteration, then with a whole choice of dual wield and two-handed, taking in mind the powers they offer and the synergies they create. Would be amazing if it all gets perfectly balanced, providing awesome choices for Frost players. But overall, we still have some issues, for sure, like mentioned in the beginning, like GCDs, but taking everything in mind, personally Frost is playing pretty decently. I can have some nice, fun times with it, while also dealing some pretty meaningful damage. I also loved, like in Unholy, all the interesting synergies when matching all of these borrowed powers. I really found that really quite fun. Okay guys, that covers Frost, so do let me know what you think about Frost DKs here in Shadowlands down below, and as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.